How to detect warning signs of a problem tenant. You've already seen it happen to someone you know, or maybe it happened to you directly. A tenant seemed perfectly fine during the initial walkthrough, answered every question smoothly, smiled at the right moments, and then 3 months later, you're dealing with unpaid rent, a trashed unit, noise complaints from every neighbor on the floor, and a legal battle that drains your bank account and your sanity simultaneously. Problem tenants are one of the most expensive and emotionally exhausting challenges any landlord can face. And the terrifying part is that most of the warning signs were there from the very beginning. You just didn't know what to look for. Welcome back to the channel. And if you're new here, please hit that like button right now, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you never miss another video that could protect your investment. Today, we are going deep on this topic because detecting a problem tenant before they ever set foot inside your property is a skill. And like any skill, it can be learned, refined, and mastered. We're going to walk through 6 real-world case studies that reveal exactly how warning signs appear in practice, what they look like in real life, and what you should have done at each critical moment to avoid disaster. Let's start with case study number 1, and this one is about urgency and pressure. A landlord had a 2-bedroom unit become available and listed it on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, someone had already reached out expressing extreme enthusiasm. The prospective tenant said they needed to move in immediately, that their current living situation was unbearable, and that they would pay the first month up front in cash right away if they could just skip the application process and move in that weekend. The landlord felt the pressure building. The unit had been sitting vacant for 3 weeks already, and the financial strain of carrying an empty property was real. So the landlord agreed to a quick move-in with a promise to complete the application paperwork afterward. That paperwork never got completed. The tenant moved in, paid 1 month of rent, and then began a cycle of excuses that stretched across 4 months before the eviction process was finally initiated. The unit suffered significant damage to the bathroom fixtures, the kitchen flooring, and 2 interior doors. The total loss exceeded $8,000 when you factored in lost rent, repairs, and legal fees. The warning sign here was the extreme urgency combined with the desire to bypass the screening process. Any legitimate tenant who is a good fit for your property will understand that proper screening protects both parties. When someone pushes back hard against your standard procedures or tries to accelerate the process in a way that removes your due diligence steps, that is your first and loudest alarm. Never let vacancy anxiety rush you into a decision that your gut and your process are both telling you to slow down on. This is exactly the kind of scenario we break down in full detail inside the Effective Property Management course, where you can click the link in the description to become a member and learn how to build systems that protect you even when the pressure is on. Case study number 2 involves income verification red flags. A landlord had a nice ground floor unit available and received an application from someone who appeared very promising on paper at first glance. They claimed a monthly income that was comfortably above the standard 3 times rent threshold that most landlords use as a benchmark. However, when the landlord requested pay stubs and employer verification, the applicant became evasive. They said their employer was a small private company and didn't have a formal HR department that could respond to verification calls. They offered instead to provide a bank statement, which showed a lump sum deposit from 3 months ago, but very little consistent income activity. The applicant explained this away as having done some freelance work. The landlord, eager to fill the unit, accepted this explanation and approved the application. Within 6 weeks, rent was late. By month 3, the tenant was 2 full months behind and had stopped responding to messages entirely. A lengthy eviction process followed. Here is what the landlord missed. Legitimate income, whether from employment or self-employment, leaves a consistent and verifiable paper trail. One large deposit surrounded by minimal activity is not evidence of stable income. It is evidence of a one-time event. Self-employed applicants can absolutely be excellent tenants, but they need to provide multiple months of bank statements, tax returns from the previous year, and ideally a letter from an accountant or a client contract showing ongoing work. If an applicant cannot or will not provide these things, that unwillingness is itself the answer you needed. The verification process exists specifically for moments like this one. Now let's get into case study number 3, which is about the previous landlord reference that should have ended the conversation immediately. A landlord was screening a tenant who came across as well-spoken, organized, and genuinely pleasant to interact with. The application looked solid and the credit score was acceptable. When it came time to call the previous landlord reference, something interesting happened. The number provided went to what appeared to be a personal cell phone, and the person who answered gave an extremely enthusiastic reference. They described the applicant as one of the best tenants they had ever had. Always paid on time, never caused problems, kept the property immaculate. It sounded almost too good. The current landlord felt reassured and moved forward with approval. What they discovered later, after the tenancy had gone sideways with chronic late payments and a series of complaints from neighboring units, was that the reference phone number belonged to a friend of the applicant, not an actual former landlord. The tip-off had been there, but went unnoticed. A genuinely enthusiastic reference that cannot provide specific details, such as the exact address of the property, the lease start and end dates, the monthly rent amount, or any memorable challenges that were handled professionally, is likely not a real landlord reference. When you call a previous landlord, you should be cross-referencing that number against public records or property ownership databases to confirm the person you're speaking with actually owned or managed the property in question. You should also be asking open-ended questions that require specific knowledge, not just asking whether they would recommend the tenant. That question alone can be answered by anyone. Case study number 4 takes us into the territory of behavior during property viewings, and this one is surprisingly telling. A landlord showed a unit to a prospective tenant and noticed several things during the walkthrough that individually might have seemed minor, but together painted a picture worth paying attention to. The applicant arrived 20 minutes late without sending any message in advance. When the landlord pointed out a small scuff on the wall from the previous tenant, the applicant immediately launched into a detailed explanation of how they planned to repaint the entire unit themselves and rearrange the floor plan to suit their lifestyle. When asked about their previous rental experience, they spoke at length and with considerable emotion about how their last landlord had been completely unreasonable and had treated them unfairly over minor issues. By the end of the viewing, the landlord had heard 3 separate complaints about 3 different previous living situations, all of which ended with someone else being entirely at fault. The landlord still approved the application, thinking the applicant simply had bad luck with housing. The tenancy ended after 8 months with a formal complaint from the building manager, damage to a load-bearing wall that the tenant had attempted to modify without permission, and an unpaid balance of several $1,000s. The warning signs were visible during that first 20-minute walkthrough. Someone who is chronically late without communicating, who immediately begins planning unauthorized modifications, and who has a pattern of blaming every previous landlord for every previous problem is showing you who they are before you ever hand them a key. Believe those signals. Let's move into case study number 5, which deals with something that is easy to overlook because it seems like it might be the tenant just being helpful or thorough. This case study is about the cosigner situation being used to obscure a weak primary applicant. A landlord had a unit available at a mid-range price point and received an application from someone whose credit profile showed a history of collections, a previous eviction filing that had been dismissed, and income that was below the standard qualification threshold. However, the applicant immediately offered a cosigner, presenting this as though it resolved all concerns. The cosigner had excellent credit and stable income, and the landlord reasoned that having a financially strong cosigner would protect them if anything went wrong. The lease was signed with both parties on the agreement. The tenancy began with 2 months of on time payment, then shifted into a pattern of partial payments and regular excuses. When the landlord attempted to enforce the lease terms and involve the cosigner disputed their liability, claiming they had not been clearly informed of the specific terms they were signing for. The resulting situation required legal assistance to untangle and still did not result in full recovery of the outstanding balance. There are two important lessons inside this case study. First, a cosigner does not transform a high-risk applicant into a low-risk one. It adds a layer of potential recovery, but it does not change the fundamental risk profile of the person who will actually be living in your property and making or not making rent payments every month. Second, if you do accept a cosigner, that cosigner must undergo the same thorough screening process as the primary applicant, and the lease documentation must be ironclad and clearly explained to all parties before any signatures are collected. The Effective Property Management course walks you through exactly how to structure cosigner agreements and screen all parties appropriately, so you avoid the kind of costly outcome this landlord experienced. Click the link in the description to become a member and access those resources right now. Case study number 6 is one of the most psychologically interesting examples because it involves a tenant who actually had a strong application on paper and passed basic screening, but whose behavior in the early weeks of tenancy was a clear predictor of the problems that followed. A landlord rented a unit to someone whose credit score was strong, whose income was verified at more than 3 times the monthly rent, and whose previous landlord reference checked out as legitimate. Everything looked great, but within the first 2 weeks of occupancy, the landlord began receiving frequent messages at unusual hours, asking about minor things that were already outlined in the lease. The tenant called to ask whether they were allowed to have guests, despite this being clearly addressed in the agreement they had signed. They sent photos of tiny marks on the walls, claiming these were pre-existing damage, despite the move-in inspection having been completed and signed off. They complained to the building manager about a neighbor twice within the first 10 days, both times over issues that the building manager described as non-events. By week 3, the landlord was spending a disproportionate amount of time managing communication with this single tenant, compared to all other units combined. What followed over the next year was a pattern of manufactured conflict, unreasonable demands, and ultimately a dispute over the return of the security deposit that required formal mediation. The financial damage was moderate compared to some other cases, but the time cost and emotional drain were significant. This case study teaches something important about the early days of a tenancy being a preview of the relationship dynamic ahead. A tenant who immediately begins testing boundaries, creating documentation for perceived grievances, and consuming your time and energy at a disproportionate rate in the very first weeks is showing you the pattern they intend to maintain. High maintenance behavior that appears this early rarely improves over time. It typically escalates. So what do all 6 of these case studies have in common? Every single one of them involved warning signs that were visible before or shortly after the tenancy began. In every case, the landlord had an opportunity to pause, to ask more questions, to verify more thoroughly, or to trust the discomfort they were already feeling. And in every case, that opportunity was either missed or consciously set aside in favor of filling the vacancy. This is not about blaming landlords for these outcomes. The pressures of property ownership are real and relentless. Vacant units cost money. Screening takes time. The fear of discrimination claims makes many landlords hesitant to ask probing questions. But here's the fundamental truth that experienced property managers will tell you without hesitation. A short-term vacancy is always less expensive than a long-term problem tenant. Always. The month or 2 of rental income you sacrifice by taking the time to screen properly is a fraction of the financial and emotional cost of placing the wrong person in your property. Let's talk about what a truly effective screening process actually looks like when built to catch these warning signs before they become your reality. The first layer is your application documentation. Your application should collect comprehensive information that you then verify independently and thoroughly. Employment history, income documentation covering at least 3 months, rental history going back at least 2 years, and personal references that you actually contact. This documentation is the foundation, but it is only as useful as the effort you put into verifying every piece of it. Cross reference employer information against public business records. Look up the addresses of previous rentals and verify ownership through your local property records database. Check that the income amounts stated match what the documentation actually shows, rather than taking an applicant's summary at face value. The second layer is the credit and background check. A credit report tells you far more than just a score. Look at the specific types of accounts that are in collections. Look at the pattern of payment history rather than just the overall summary. A single medical debt in collections tells a very different story than 3 separate utility accounts and a previous landlord collection all appearing at once. Background checks should be reviewed carefully and within the bounds of your local fair housing laws, which vary significantly by jurisdiction. Understand what you are and are not permitted to consider in your specific area before making decisions based on background information. The third layer is the conversation itself. How you interact with a prospective tenant during showings and during the application process reveals enormous amounts of information that no document can capture. Pay attention to how they treat your time. Pay attention to how they speak about previous landlords and neighbors. Pay attention to whether they ask thoughtful questions about the property and lease terms, or whether their questions are focused primarily on what they can get away with or modify. A tenant who asks whether they can break the lease early within the first conversation is telling you something. A tenant who asks detailed questions about maintenance response times and what the process is for reporting issues is also telling you something. The fourth layer, and this one is underutilized by the majority of independent landlords, is the move-in process itself. A thorough move-in inspection, documented with photographs and video, signed by both parties, is your legal foundation if a dispute arises at the end of the tenancy. But beyond the legal protection, how a tenant behaves during the move-in inspection also tells you something. A tenant who rushes through it, refuses to sign the documentation, or begins the conversation about what repairs or upgrades they expect you to make before they can be satisfied is already creating the conditions for future conflict. Take the move-in process seriously. Take your time with it and treat it as both a protective measure and an additional opportunity to observe and assess. Protecting your investment is not just about finding good tenants. It is equally about creating and consistently enforcing a system that makes it difficult for warning signs to go unnoticed. Most problem tenancies do not begin with a single dramatic red flag. They begin with a collection of small signals that individually seem manageable, but collectively should have triggered a harder look. The reason landlords miss them is not lack of intelligence or experience. It is the absence of a structured framework that forces you to slow down and evaluate every data point before making a final decision. That framework is exactly what we have built inside the Effective Property Management course, where thousands of landlords have learned to protect their properties, their income, and their peace of mind through systems that work consistently, regardless of how persuasive or urgent any individual applicant might seem. If you want to build that kind of confidence in your screening and management process, click the link in the description to become a member and start learning today. Before we wrap up, let's also talk about what to do once you've already identified a potential warning sign mid-tenancy, because sometimes the signals do not appear until after move-in. Maybe the first rent payment is late. Maybe you receive a complaint from a neighbor within the first 30 days. Maybe the tenant contacts you with a request that falls well outside what the lease permits. In these situations, your response in the early moments of the problem matters enormously. Document everything immediately and comprehensively. Every late payment, every complaint received, every conversation had, including the date, time, and content of that conversation. Issue formal written notices according to your local tenancy laws as soon as a violation occurs. Do not rely on informal conversations or text messages as your primary form of communication when addressing lease violations. Keep your emotional response measured and professional. Problem tenancies become far more complicated and legally dangerous when landlords respond emotionally rather than procedurally. The system you have built in advance is what protects you when things go wrong, which is why having that system before you need it is so critical. And if you found this video genuinely useful, please take a moment right now to like and subscribe to my channel, because we are consistently putting out content designed to make you a more informed, more protected, and more profitable property owner. And your support is what makes it possible to keep creating these resources. There is one more thing worth addressing before we close, which is the psychological dimension of this entire process. Landlords are human beings. The person sitting across from you during a viewing is also a human being, and that creates a natural social pressure to be accommodating, to give the benefit of the doubt, to not want to seem difficult or suspicious. Problem tenants often exploit this dynamic intentionally or unconsciously. Urgency, likability, a compelling personal story, a frustrating previous living situation that makes them seem sympathetic rather than problematic. These are all things that can override your rational screening process if you let the emotional connection you build during a viewing carry more weight than the facts in front of you. The best defense against this is a written, non-negotiable screening criteria document that you create before you ever list a unit for rent. This document outlines the minimum income requirements, the acceptable credit score range, the rental history requirements, the background check criteria within legal limits, and any other standards you apply consistently to every applicant, regardless of how the in-person interaction made you feel. When your criteria are written down and applied uniformly, you protect yourself legally and you protect yourself emotionally from the persuasive pressure that can make a red flag look like an opportunity if you are not careful. This is not about being cold or transactional. It is about being professional in a way that protects both you and your tenants by ensuring that every decision you make is grounded in verifiable information rather than instinct alone. Instinct has a role, absolutely, especially when something feels wrong and you cannot quite identify why. But instinct should be a signal to investigate further, not a replacement for the investigation itself. Build your system, apply it consistently, trust the data, and let the warning signs do the job they were always meant to do, which is to give you the information you need to make a confident and informed decision before you ever hand over those keys.